Unit 6, Absolutism versus Constitutionalism. France under Louis XIV. As England's revolutionary crisis was dying down, a very different era dawned in France. With the death of Cardinal Mazarin in 1661, Louis XIV assumed personal leadership of the French government. Circumstances were ideal for an ostentatious reign. No radical innovations were required for the young king, for Henry IV, Richelieu, and Mazarin had already laid down his guidelines. The French aristocracy were eager to be commanded by a king who acted the part. Louis's army and his revenues were by far the largest in Europe. France had just defeated Spain in the 30 Years' War, and with Germany divided, England distracted, and the Dutch posing no true military threat, French international domination was incontestable. Louis XIV might not have been successful in many occupations, but he was perfect to be divine right monarch. He was incredibly confident, at times to a detriment, and exuded majesty. He was not the most intelligent monarch of his time, not to say ignorant by any means. He hated to read, but he was good. He was a good listener and enjoyed presiding over council meetings for several hours a day. In fact, greater brilliance would have handicapped Louis in his crucial position as leader of the French aristocracy, a role in which breeding and ceremony counted for more than brains. Louis moved his royal court from the Louvre to Versailles, 12 miles outside Paris, partly to escape the Parisian mobs and partly to provide a suitably huge yet secluded social center for the aristocracy. At Versailles, he built a colossal palace, the facade a third of a mile long and mind-blowingly ornate. The actual grounds of Versailles, including the gardens and canals, was the equivalent of the city of Paris, about 30 square miles. By the end of the 17th century, 10,000 members of the aristocracy, officials, and servants lived there. 60% of the royal tax revenue was spent on Versailles and the upkeep of Louis's court. The secret of Louis XIV's success was really very simple. He and he alone could give the French aristocracy and the upper bourgeoisie what they each wanted more than anything else at the moment. The French aristocracy had long been the most troublesome and unmanageable element of French society. Louis honored and glorified their exclusive world of social privilege and constructed a microcosm of entitlement. They alone were permitted to attend the king at Versailles. He shrewdly required all of the chief members of the nobility to live at court, where he could keep an eye on them. He regimented every aspect of his own daily routine and that of the nobility by a strict code of palace etiquette, so as to impart order to the huge court, exalt his own person, and domesticate the high nobility. Only through constant court attendance could an aristocrat obtain favors and pensions. The king had numerous positions of honor in his gift. Deserving aristocrats were appointed bishops, generals, provincial governors, and even foreign ambassadors. All aristocrats enjoyed tax exemption. Overall, the aristocracy under Louis XIV enjoyed little real power. While Louis XIV encouraged the aristocracy to become useless parasites, he invited the upper bourgeoisie to govern France under his direction. Louis took his executive responsibilities as seriously as the court pageantry. After Mazarin's death, he made all important decisions himself. His boast, "L'État c'est moi," I am the state, summed up his mantra of absolute monarchy. Louis believed he personified France and identified his power with the will of the people. Like his Bourbon predecessors, Louis preferred middle-class men as his ministers, conciliars, and intendants. No members of the royal family or high aristocracy were admitted to the daily council sessions at Versailles. With the lower classes, however, Louis did little, with the exception of protection. However, in a society where 80% of the population were farmers, very little was done to stimulate increased agricultural productivity. Many French peasants owned their own land, but they still had to render semi-feudal dues and service to local aristocrats. The idle poor were drafted to the French army or put to work in workhouses. The tax burden on the poor was pitiless, and by the end of Louis's reign it had doubled. For much of Louis's reign, he left many of the economic decisions to the very able Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Colbert had managed Cardinal Mazarin's personal finances, and under Louis XIV he became finance minister from 1661 to 1683. Colbert established a mercantilist policy. According to the doctrine of mercantilism, governments must intervene to increase national wealth by whatever means possible. This involved becoming as self-sufficient as possible initially, and then seeking exploitation of foreign governments and colonialism. After making France as self-sufficient as possible, he established overseas trading companies, standardized production methods for textiles, paper, and soap, and put special effort into sponsoring the manufacturing of luxury goods in France itself. To protect French production, Colbert enacted high foreign tariffs, especially against the Dutch and the English. To further compete against those two, Colbert subsidized shipbuilding, which led to the expanding of French colonialism. It's under Colbert's guidance that you see that the French expansion of sugar plantations in the Caribbean, and more importantly, the settling of Canada west to the Great Lakes. Religiously, Louis XIV was not incredibly pious. Still, he saw a national religion as vital in creating a sense of uniformity in the French nation. Louis refused to share control of the French Catholic Church with the Pope and encouraged his bishops to assert that the Pope had no secular control over them. Louis had two major problems with religious minorities. The first were the emergence of the Janists. The Janists were Catholics who held similar predestination ideas that Calvin discussed. This movement attracted many of the most brilliant in France, including Blaise Pascal. Nevertheless, Janism was not the prescribed ideas of the French Church, so Louis found it intolerable. He drove them to surrender, prison, or exile. But it was the Huguenots that Louis undertook to eradicate the Protestant heresy. He demolished the Huguenot churches and schools, paid cash gratuities to converts, and quartered soldiers in the houses of those who refused to convert. In 1685, Louis XIV issued the Edict of Fontainebleau, which revoked the Edict of Nantes, and alas, the Huguenots now had no civil rights. Their children were forced to be raised as Catholics, and the clergy were exiled or executed. The most stubborn Huguenots fled to England, the Dutch Republic, or America. He willingly accepted the loss of the Huguenots as he claimed the right to control the consciousness of his subjects. Regarding religion, his motto was un roi, une loi, une foi. One king, one law, one faith. Still, the most dynamic part of Louis XIV's rule was his foreign policy and constant wars. First, it was important to note that Louis was a master at marrying himself and his family members into almost every royal family in Europe. But in war, he raised massive armies with which to pursue his dynastic and territorial ambitions and challenge the international balance of power. But France's rivals kept pace. Louis discovered, as Philip II had before him, that war and an international coalition could bankrupt even the mightiest king. During the first half of his reign, from 1661 to 1688, Louis XIV's foreign policy had reached its pinnacle. Two major wars took place during this time, the War of Devolution and the Dutch War. The War of Devolution, taking place between 1667 and 8, began with the French invasion of the Spanish Netherlands and the Franche-Comté, as also a Spanish possession on France's eastern border. Spain was saved when the Triple Alliance of England, the Dutch Republic, and Sweden intervened in the war and forced Louis to withdraw. Louis then succeeded in breaking up the Triple Alliance by signing the Treaty of Dover with Charles II of England. Louis then invaded the Dutch Republic in 1672. During the Dutch War between 72 and 78, the Dutch defended themselves by opening the dikes, which resulted in the flooding of much of Holland. The Dutch also secured the support of the Austrians, Spain, and Brandenburg Prussia. Louis's policy of conquest can be described as piecemeal aggrandizement, taking small areas of land at spaced out intervals of time. During this time, he managed to lull or intimidate most of his enemies. He had acquired Artois in 1659, and Lille in 1668, Lorraine in 1670, Franche-Comté in 1674, part of Flanders in 1678, and Luxembourg in 1684. Next on the horizon was the German Rhineland and the Dutch Republic itself. But after 1688, Louis's foreign policy suddenly stopped working so smoothly. France had to wage 25 years of grueling warfare against international coalition, which first halted Louis's expansion and then threw him on the defensive. The organizer of this anti-French coalition was the master politician to the country, William of Orange. A frail little Dutchman, William spent his entire career fighting Louis XIV and all he stood for. Prince William III of Orange was a stadtholder, or chief executive officer of the Dutch Republic, and the great-grandson of William the Silent.